The outbreak of the Great War came as a surprise to the Australian people. The crisis bubbled up out of nowhere. Most Australians accepted the fact that their nation had been committed to war by the British Empire. They were basically loyal. Some of them were enthusiastic, especially those who enlisted early, but most people simply accepted the outbreak of war. But there were significant exceptions. Trade unionists, the very small proportion of communists, and some ethnic minorities like Irish and Germans were very uneasy about the outbreak of a war in which they might find themselves on the wrong side. The Australian government had a great need of men, especially because Prime Minister Billy Hughes had promised Britain 20,000 men a month. So volunteers had to be found. And remember, it was only possible to enlist as a volunteer in the Australian Imperial Force. So the government worked through local and state committees using local dignitaries, worthies, clergymen, newspaper editors and so on, who would try and persuade young men to enlist. And they had to be persuaded. The early calls to enlist because of duty and empire tended to stop working after a while. So the government used more and more insidious and insinuating methods to get men to feel guilty to enlist, or to imagine that there was a German threat to Australia, which of course was impossible. And eventually they persuaded 300,000 men to join as volunteers to fight in the Great War. How did Australians learn about the Gallipoli campaign? Well, they mostly read about it in newspapers. And so it took time for the impression to accumulate that the Gallipoli campaign was a serious matter and it was costing the lives of many Australians, because casualty lists were published in newspapers week by week. So by July 1915, thousands of men are trying to join the Australian Imperial Force. And in July 1915, about 35,000 men joined. That's about 10% of the number of Australians who joined for the whole war. And they joined because of the reports coming back about Gallipoli. They're also encouraged to join because of propaganda that's distributed, to get men to come and support their mates, to be a man, to join up and do your bit. And all of these appeals work because by the end of the Gallipoli campaign, there are about 200,000 Australians who are fighting overseas. You'll often hear people say that all the young men went to the Great War, but in fact they didn't. Only about 40% of those who were eligible to go actually went. So a lot of Australians men made decisions that they weren't going to enlist. In order to persuade them to enlist, the government embarked on a whole series of propaganda campaigns, recruiting marches where men would march from one country town to another, with the march so-called snowballing as it went. They obviously produced propaganda posters in which men would be explicitly urged to enlist on a whole variety of ways. Enlist because the Germans threaten Australia, enlist because you're going to protect your women folk, enlist to save the empire. There's a whole series of ways in which men were being urged and manipulated into enlisting. By the end of it, though, only about 4 men in 10 who could have enlisted did. So there's clearly a lot of resistance to the idea of joining this war. The Australian Imperial Force was a force of about 7 divisions, and that meant that it needed to recruit about 100,000 men, and then it needed to recruit men to replace those who were killed or wounded or went sick. And so there was a continual pressure right through the war for men to join up, not just at the beginning, but right the way through. And remember, men are being killed in huge numbers and being wounded and disabled. So on the Somme in 1916, Australia loses about 28,000 casualties through the course of the Battle of the Somme, and those men have to be replaced. But if you look at the graph of numbers who enlisted, you find that in fact they didn't enlist in equal numbers through the war. There's a small splurge to begin with. Not everybody joins up in 1914. Large numbers join up in 1915, and in fact by the end of 1915 about half of those who are going to join have joined. And then for the rest of the war, there's a struggle to get numbers to enlist. So right across the country in 1916, they're probably getting about 4,000 men enlisting voluntarily, which is about a quarter of what the Prime Minister has promised he can deliver to the British Empire. And then in 1917, the numbers go down again, in the wake of the conscription referenda of 1916, in which Australians basically rejected the idea of men being conscripted for service. And into 1918, it's even harder. Another conscription referendum in December 1917. So it's even harder to get men to enlist. So by the last year of the war, the only people who are coming forward are very young men who've grown up as adolescents, as 16 and 17-year-olds, who are expecting and are being expected to join up. So that there's a continual struggle in Australia. Whose son has volunteered? Whose son hasn't? Whose son's gone to Queensland to get out of the finger pointing that happens? Whose son has been given a white feather to insinuate that he's a coward? These pressures affected every family in Australia.